is Read Japanese Literature. My name is Allison Fincher. Read Japanese Literature is a podcast about Japanese fiction and some of its best works. All the works we discuss are available in translation, so you can read along if you want, and you can find out more at readjapaneseliterature.com. If you've been listening to the podcast for a couple of months, you may remember that I've been promising an episode about works of Japanese literature translated into films. So I sat down and made a list. You can find it on the episode page. I found more than 120 translated Japanese books and short stories that have been made into movies. And I know that list is missing titles. No wonder I was feeling a bit overwhelmed. So instead, allow me to present an episode about just 2 Japanese stories adapted into movies. 2 novellas by highly regarded authors of print fiction that have unique relationships with their film counterparts. 2 stories about kaiju. Any fan of Japanese culture likely knows Tokyo is occasionally sacked by a giant monster, at least on the big screen. These monsters are kaiju, literally strange beasts. That's a word we'll learn more about in just a minute. Today we're going to look at the stories of 2 kaiju, the world's most iconic kaiju, Godzilla, and the most recent kaiju to have her novella translated into English, Mothra. I'm relying heavily on Jeffrey Engels' afterwords to his translations of Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again, and the Luminous Fairies and Mothra. I'm also going to be describing the plots of both Godzilla and Mothra. These stories have been in the public imagination since 1954 and 1961, respectively, and there's still a lot to enjoy by reading the books or seeing the films, even if you know what's going to happen. I certainly enjoyed both movies more because I'd already read the novella. If you are a really spoiler-sensitive listener, I suggest you watch the films or read the books before you listen to this episode. I've split this episode into 2 parts. First, we'll talk about Godzilla, the history and context behind the story, the author, and then the story itself, the film, and how it adapts its source material. After that, we'll cover the same ideas about Mothra. We'll end with a brief reflection about what movie viewers gain by picking up the novellas too. I learned way more than I expected about the history of the word kaiju when I was prepping this episode. I really had to share it with you. My knowledge comes from folklorist, translator, and Eisner-winning comics writer Zach Davison in his awesome book, The Ultimate Guide to Japanese Yokai, highly recommended. Even though we think of kaiju as a fixture of modern filmmaking, the word kaiju is actually ancient. The kanji combo first appears in the ancient Chinese Shanhai Jing, pronounced obviously in Japanese. Shanhai Jing is a mythical geography of pre-Qin China. It doesn't mean giant monster. Kaiju literally means strange beast, like weird animal. It could be a dragon. It could be a Silk Road trader's description of a giraffe, an animal that actually exists but seems implausible. It's just a strange beast. Side note, Shanhai Jing is one of the travelogues that Tatsuhiko Shibusawa parodies in his novel Takaoka's Travels. Takaoka's Travels is one of my very favorite novels available in translation from Japanese. It was translated by David Boyd. Highly recommended too. The word kaiju was adopted into Japanese in the late Edo period. In the Meiji era, it came to mean weird animal that doesn't live in Japan or in places that Japanese people normally go. Sometimes the word was pronounced as kawaiju, implying scary animal or monster. The word kawaii, not kawaii, but kawaii, means scary. When giant Hollywood monster movies made their way to Japan, those monsters were dubbed kaiju. Today, we English speakers tend to think kaiju have to be big, but they don't. Even in contemporary Japanese usage, Godzilla's son, Minera, starts out about the same size as a person. He's still a kaiju. Apparently no one likes Minera, I found out, but he's a kaiju anyway. Fairy Mothra, a cat-sized reincarnation of Mothra from Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, is a kaiju. But you might even ask, why do kaiju show up in the Ultimate Guide to Japanese Yokai? Is a kaiju a yokai? I'm not going to take a lot of time here to define yokai. If yokai is not an idea you're familiar with, this argument doesn't matter to you anyway, and that is totally fine. We're kind of in the weeds for the moment. Zach Davison says, yes, Godzilla and other kaiju are yokai. Although he admits some folks will argue with him, the idea that kaiju are just commercial products and therefore they can't be yokai doesn't hold water. For one, there are strange beasts, there are kaiju, predating free market capitalism. And for another, there are some fun yokai that clearly emerged as sales gimmicks. Tofu Kozo is one of my favorites. He's a little impish yokai that occasionally follows you home on a rainy night. He likely originated as the logo of a Meiji-era tofu seller. And most compellingly, in 1954's Godzilla, characters briefly describe the monster they encounter as a yokai. Allow me to set the scene for our discussion of Godzilla with a little bit of World War II and post-World War II history. It's going to help you understand why Godzilla was actually a revolutionary story. The Japanese government heavily censored literature in the lead up to World War II. We talked about the censorship of proletarian writers in an episode last season. We talked about World War II censorship more broadly in a Season 1 episode, Japanese Literature in World War II. There are links to both episodes on the episode page. By the 1940s, almost every author was being censored. For example, Donald Keene reports that Junichiro Tanazaki's famous novel, The Makioka Sisters, ceased serialization after just 2 installments. The magazine carrying it explained, quote, having taken into consideration the possibility that this novel might exert an undesirable influence, in view of present exigencies at this decisive stage of the war, we have regretfully decided from the standpoint of self-discipline to discontinue further publication. By 1944, there wasn't much paper left for printing anyway. At noon on August 15, 1945, the Emperor of Japan made his first ever radio broadcast, and it announced Japan's unconditional surrender. After Japan's defeat, the enforcement of censorship laws was quickly relaxed. Criticism of the emperor system quickly became not just tolerated, but even commonplace. That October, American occupation officials made declarations that guaranteed freedoms of speech, of the press, and of assembly. But the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, or SCAP, also set up the Civil Censorship Detachment, or CCD. The CCD enforced censorship on behalf of the American government. CCD's target was writing deemed feudalistic or patriotic, anything occupation leadership thought might support a resurgence of militarism. SCAP was also understandably wary of accounts of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and their aftermath. We'll come back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in just a minute. CCD also censored any mention the U.S. wasn't practicing what it preached. Any mention that CCD was censoring things was censored. Censorship affected the Japanese people's ability to come to grips with what had happened to them. John Dower wrote one of the most highly regarded English language books about this time period, Embracing Defeat. He describes how, quote, the need to grieve publicly, to mourn and speak well of the dead, in some instances unsurprisingly transgressed what the censors deemed proper and permissible. Japan lost between 2.5 and 3.1 million people between 1939 and 1945, and that doesn't include the people who died earlier in Japan's Pacific War. Up to 4.3% of Japan's January 1939 population was dead by the end of World War II. fire bombings in Japan were notably terrible. The March 10th, 1945 firebombing of Tokyo was perhaps the single most destructive bombing raid in human history, killing more than 100,000 people in a single night. Quite probably more people than were killed in the bombings of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. All told, CCD censorship wasn't in place for all that long. By fall 1949, CCD ended its censorship operations entirely, but mentions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were still expected to be nothing more than objective scientific fact. No art and no emotion. So what about Hiroshima and Nagasaki? It is difficult to overstate the immediate and ongoing impact of the American use of nuclear weapons on the psyche and history of Japan. On August 6, 1945, the U.S. B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped an enriched uranium gun-type fission weapon on the city of Hiroshima. Hiroshima is on Japan's main island of Honshu along the coast of the Inland Sea. No one is exactly sure how many people were killed. It's likely that somewhere between 66 and 140,000 people were killed the day of the bombing, and another 100,000 or more were injured. 3 days later, on August 9th, 1945, the B-29 Boxcar dropped a plutonium implosion-type nuclear weapon on the city of Nagasaki on the Japanese island of Kyushu. As in Hiroshima, there is still no consensus about the number of people killed by the American bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Immediate death estimates range from 22 to 75,000 people, with another 60,000 injuries. When the Emperor of Japan made that famous 1945 radio address, he explicitly mentioned the United States' terrible new weapon. Quote, "The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives." He went on that if the war continued, the bomb could cause, quote, "an ultimate obliteration of the Japanese nation," and added that it could certainly cause, quote, "the total extinction of human civilization." Some people in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki looked uninjured, but then began to show bizarre symptoms: nausea, internal bleeding, hair loss, fever, purple patches all over their bodies. They were victims of what was then called atomic bomb sickness. We now understand it's radiation poisoning. Again, we'll probably never know the exact number, but one atomic bomb casualty commission report estimates that almost 7,000 people likely died of acute radiation syndrome in Hiroshima within a month of the American bombing. A similar number likely died of the same cause in the same period in Nagasaki. Even given all of that, all the death, all the destruction, with a tiny number of exceptions, there was very little opinion writing about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and almost every literary work was purely documentary. There were even very few of those. CCD didn't even allow the release of photographs of the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki until the early 1950s. And this is the context in which the story of Godzilla was born. So, what does the history of censorship and the history of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have to do with a movie about a giant radioactive dinosaur? The American occupation of Japan ended in April 1952. That was years or even decades earlier than most people had expected. Notably, the U.S. retained control of Okinawa and the right to maintain military bases and troops in Japan. We'll turn back to that right when we turn to our discussion of Mothra. Toho Studios was an entertainment company that had been around for 2 decades by the time the U.S. withdrew from most of Japan in 1952. Today, Toho is the producer of kaiju films, not just the 33 films featuring Godzilla as of February 2026. Toho's Big Five also includes the giant irradiated pteranodon Radon, who premiered in 1956. Hey, side note, did y'all know pteranodons aren't dinosaurs? They are technically flying reptiles. My kid came home from kindergarten years ago and corrected me. Anyway, the other big five monsters are Mothra, Mothra, who debuted in 1961. We'll discuss her in the second half of the episode. Also, the giant dragon-esque alien King Ghidorah. King Ghidorah. Like the English word king is a part of his name, spelled out in katakana. He debuted in 1964. The final of the big five is the mechanical Godzilla created by extraterrestrial invaders, Mechagodzilla, who debuted in 1974. In 1954, a Toho producer named Tomoyuki Tanaka was on his way home from an unsuccessful business trip to Indonesia. On the plane, he happened to read a magazine article about the 1953 American movie, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms is based on Ray Bradbury's story, The Foghorn. The movie was also inspired by America's own sort of proto-kaiju, King Kong, who debuted in 1933 and saw an important theatrical re-release in 1952. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms is about a dinosaur in the Arctic, woken up by atomic bomb testing, who goes on a destructive rampage along the Atlantic seaboard. Ring any bells? By the way, the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms was definitely ID'd as a kaiju when the film was translated into Japanese. Tanaka approached Toho with a pitch for a movie tentatively titled The Giant Monster from 20,000 Miles Under the Sea in mid-May 1954. When he got the go-ahead, he rushed to the home of one of Japan's most popular contemporary writers, Shigeru Kayama. Tanaka was a big fan. Shigeru Kayama often gets left out of the story of Godzilla, which tends to focus on the director and the special effects producer. But Kayama's role is critical. Shigeru Kayama was born as Koji Yamada in Tokyo in 1904. Shigeru Kayama is a pen name, but I'm going to go ahead and use it as his name for the rest of the episode for the sake of clarity. Kayama went on to become a prolific Japanese science fiction writer, Japanese SF writer. Sadly, though, Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again is the only work by Yamada available in English as of February 2026. Kayama was an animal-loving little boy with a special love for lizards and reptiles. As a teenager, he took up an interest in paleontology after he read Dr. Matajiro Yokoyama's book, A Prehistory of the World. He formally studied economics at Hosei University, but continued to study paleontology and geology in his spare time. In 1927, Kayama dropped out of university to start a full-time job at the Ministry of Finance, where he worked until the end of World War II. By 1947, he was 43 years old and World War II was over. Japanese publishing was slowly recovering from the consequences of censorship and paper shortages, and Kayama was ready to try something new. He submitted a short story to a mystery magazine called Jewels in search of the cash prize they were offering. If you've listened to RJL's episodes about mysteries or SF, you'll know 1947 was still a little more than a decade before Japanese publishing started to meaningfully differentiate those two genres. Kayama's story, The Revenge of Orang Pendek, drew on Kayama's love for the natural world and a myth about a mysterious mythological creature. Also, it was one of just 7 stories selected from the 200 submissions to be published. The Revenge of Orang Pendek was a hit. Within a year, Kayama had won the very first Detective Mystery Club New Writers Award for his second published story, The Strange Tale of Sea Eel Estate. And by the end of 1948, Kayama had published an astonishing 44 pieces of writing. Kayama's writing career lasted about 28 years. His complete works stretches to 15 thick volumes. By the time Tomoyuki Tanaka asked Kayama to develop his idea for the giant monster from 20,000 Miles Under the Sea into a film-worthy story, Shigeru Kayama was firmly established as a writer at the height of his powers. He wrote what's called the scenario for Godzilla in just a week. Now you might be asking yourself, what the heck is a scenario? Kayama has been credited with, quote, the entire foundation for the film, the plot, characters, themes, and structure of Godzilla. That's the scenario. Director Ishiro Honda and his assistant director and screenwriter Takeo Murata took Kayama's scenario and adapted it into the film we now know as Godzilla. And whether or not Tanaka knew it, Shigeru Kayama was the perfect author for a story about a giant irradiated lizard. The man loved reptiles and loved dinosaurs, and had spent a lifetime developing casual knowledge about them. And he had an intense interest in nuclear disarmament. Kayama's monster is not radioactive by accident, or just because Ray Bradbury's story is about a radioactive monster, or just because Tomoyuki Tanaka thought it might be a good idea. In October 1954, around the time the film debuted, Kayama told an interviewer, quote, I wanted to throw myself to the best of my ability into my own form of resistance against nuclear weapons. And Kayama didn't just care about nuclear weapons because of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki almost a decade before. In March 1954, a group of Japanese fishermen on the Lucky Dragon No. 5 were accidentally caught 90 miles to the east of an American underwater nuclear test off the Bikini Atoll. All 22 members suffered from severe radiation poisoning. One, 40-year-old Aikichi Kuboyama, died within a few months. Scientists also discovered some of the fish in Japan's markets had been irradiated. Poisoning Japan's fish is a pretty big deal. Kayama realized this proposed disaster movie was actually a chance to begin a kind of conversation about some of the issues revolving around nuclear weapons for the first time since the end of the war. His original scenario for Godzilla was a much more explicit indictment, not only of nuclear weapons, but specifically of the United States, than the film Toho ultimately produced. Kayama's scenario suggested that the film open with real-life film clips. Shots like Lucky Dragon No. 5 pulling into port, burned. The disposal of radioactive tuna. The unsettling faces of harmed fishermen. He added there could be scenes of children looking sadly at the empty nests of sparrows which did not come home with their usual migration. Keep in mind, this is 1954. This is almost a full decade before Rachel Carson's Silent Spring really drove home to most Americans what the consequences of poisoning our environment might be. The final movie was ultimately less heavy-handed than Kayama's scenario. Director Honda and his assistant Murata didn't want to make an overtly political movie. They decided to use Godzilla less as an indictment of the U.S. and more as a symbol of nuclear weapons and radioactivity as a global danger. And to be fair, they were and are a global danger in the hands of the U.S. and many other countries that hold this technology. Honestly, though, once you know the story of the Lucky Dragon No. 5, it's pretty hard to miss the political context that Honda and Murata leave in the finished film. Honda and Murata just toned them down. The 1954 film Godzilla opens with the destruction of the Japanese freighter, the Eiko Maru, near the isolated Odo Island. When the Bingo Maru goes to investigate its destruction, it, too, is destroyed. One of the men involved in the search for both ships is Hideto Ogata, a brave salvage ship captain. When reporters arrive on Odo Island, an elder explains that an ancient monster named Godzilla is ruining nearby fishing. That night, disaster strikes Odo Island. 17 homes are destroyed, 9 people are killed, and 20 heads of livestock are slaughtered. Villagers from Odo Island travel to Tokyo for help. The government sends a paleontologist, Professor Kyohei Yamane, to investigate. His daughter Emiko travels as one of his assistants. The audience has already learned that Emiko is in love with the salvage ship captain Ogata, but to marry him she will need to break off her engagement to a childhood friend and one of Professor Yamane's former students, Daisuke Serizawa. Professor Yamane's investigative team doesn't just discover a giant radioactive footprint and a living trilobite. They also catch sight of a 50-meter tall monster, 160 feet, big monster. Although, quite frankly, this Godzilla would be dwarfed by any more contemporary Godzilla. Godzilla continues to get bigger in all of his movies. Professor Yamane deduces that this monster was disturbed and irradiated by underwater hydrogen bomb testing. At this point, Yamane thinks killing a creature who survived the H-bomb is impossible. Fair. And Yamane also wants to study it for clues about how to keep people safer from radiation. Back in Tokyo, Emiko attempts to break off her engagement to Serizawa. Instead, Serizawa shares a secret. He has stumbled on a horrifying scientific discovery. Emiko promises Serizawa to keep his discovery a secret. The audience will only learn later what it is. Meanwhile, Japan's self-defense forces try various measures to kill Godzilla as he makes his way from Odo Island toward one of Japan's main islands. None work. After all, Godzilla has survived the H-bomb. Godzilla makes his way to Honshu, Japan's biggest island on which the capital, Tokyo, is located, and then he goes on his iconic rampage. The next day, Emiko is horrified by the devastation, especially after she sees injured people and those suffering from radiation sickness lying in a makeshift hospital. She breaks her promised secrecy to Serizawa and tells Ogata there might be a way to kill Godzilla. Now the audience learns that what Serizawa has discovered is an oxygen destroyer that disintegrates oxygen atoms. When Serizawa drops his discovery into an aquarium, the fish first suffocate and then dissolve into nothing. Serizawa has been terrified his discovery will be turned into a superweapon. But he agrees to help Ogata and Emiko use it just once, so they have a chance to destroy Godzilla. Serizawa burns his notes before leaving the house to help them, so no one can recreate the oxygen destroyer ever again. The film's climax shows an entire fleet of Japanese ships accompanying Serizawa, Ogata, Professor Yamane, and even Emiko to deploy the oxygen destroyer against Godzilla. The device works, and Godzilla dies, but Serizawa allows the device to kill him too. He doesn't ever want to be forced to make another oxygen destroyer. The world doesn't need a device even more deadly than the hydrogen bomb. The film ends with a warning from Professor Yamane that another Godzilla may arise if humans don't stop testing nuclear weapons. Perhaps it's unsurprising that the film has 32 sequels. There's some chance listeners older than I am may be thinking, wait, that's not how it goes. What about Steve Martin, the intrepid American reporter? You, my friend, are one of the unfortunate Americans who have only seen the heavily edited and widely panned Americanization, Godzilla, King of the Monsters. It was released in 1956. Don't feel bad. That's likely true of many English speakers. The original 1954 Japanese Godzilla wasn't officially available outside of Japan until 2004. The film Godzilla was produced quickly. It was conceived in May 1954 and released in October 1954. They don't make movies that fast anymore. It was also produced expensively. It was triple the cost of the average Japanese film made at the time. The movie sold out Ginza's Nichigeki Theater, which the monster notably destroys during the movie. Godzilla also destroys the Wako Clock Tower. The iconic tower in Tokyo's wealthy and fashionable Ginza district somehow survived Tokyo's air raids. So Godzilla's destruction was almost an allegory of the monster's destruction of hope for post-World War II recovery. Those aren't the only elements of realism in the film. It's almost impossible for a non-Japanese resident in 2026 to imagine what it might have been like to watch Godzilla in Japan in 1954. The events depicted in the film would have been so immediate to the movie's original audience. There's one scene in which an otherwise unimportant woman chats with two unnamed men on the train. The three note they've already dealt with radioactive tuna. Now they have to deal with Godzilla. The woman adds, "I barely escaped the atomic bomb in Nagasaki, and now this? Evacuate again?" says one of the men. "I've had enough." Honestly, this little aside touched me as much as many other parts of the movie, thinking about all of the ways that the continued testing of nuclear weapons could impact the life of every person living in Japan. Godzilla's rampage through Tokyo also vividly recalls the destruction of the American bombing campaigns that happened less than a decade before. More than one actor involved in the film reported crying during the debut. So did Shigeru Kayama. Mystery novelist Joel Masayuki explained that the scenes, quote, recall the war devastation and make you feel like old wounds are being exposed again. There's one really terrible moment when a woman and her children realize there's no escape from Godzilla. The woman hugs her children to herself and comforts them. These children were presumably half orphaned during the war. We're going to join Daddy. We'll be where Daddy is soon. So that's the story of the 1954 film Godzilla. It debuted in October and quickly became a fan favorite. Many critics eventually came around. But the 1954 film Godzilla isn't the only version of Godzilla, or even the earliest version of Godzilla available to the public. There was an 11-episode radio version that ran between July and September 1954. The radio script was published as a standalone book in early October, shortly before the film debuted. Both the radio version and the novelization of the radio version keep Shigeru Kayama's original anti-nuclear and frankly anti-American bent in a way that the film does not. Shigeru Kayama published his own version of Godzilla and its film sequel, Godzilla Raids Again, between the October 1954 release of the first Godzilla film and the April 1955 release of the second. The two novellas are not novelizations. They're not hastily written books that depict the events in the film. You know, things like My Little Pony, the movie, the book. They are adapted versions of Kayama's original scenarios. Kayama does include some of the changes the directors and screenwriters made to his story, but he also incorporates some of his original vision. It's kind of a balancing act between what he had wanted the story to say and what the movie audience who picked up his novella would expect. Kayama's novella Godzilla is even more explicitly anti-nuclear than the film. As you readers already know, the main character of this tale, Godzilla, is an enormous imaginary kaiju, a creature that doesn't actually exist anywhere here on the planet, Kayama explains in his introduction. He continues, however, atomic and hydrogen bombs, which have taken on the form of Godzilla in this story, do exist. They are being produced and could be used for war at any moment. If that were to happen, it wouldn't just be big metropolises like Tokyo and Osaka that would be destroyed. The entire Earth would likely be laid waste. To prevent something so frightening and tragic from coming to pass, people all over the world are pouring their energy in a new movement opposing the use of atomic and hydrogen bombs. As one small member of that movement, I have tried to do my part by writing a novel, the tale you now hold in your hands. The story of Mothra also comes from some of Japan's greatest contemporary writers, and it, too, is tied to contemporary Japanese history. Although, having watched both films, allow me to clarify that the connection between contemporary political events and the plot of Mothra is significantly more subtle than the connection between Godzilla and contemporary political events. Like Godzilla, Mothra was also commissioned by Toho Studios. When Toho commissioned Mothra, it didn't ask for an allegory the way it had with Godzilla. Still, I buy the Marxist reading Jeffrey Engels presents in his afterword, which, again, I'm heavily relying on in this section of the episode. We haven't talked about Marxist literary theory since way back in the Season 2 episode, Writing About Japan's Have-Nots. A Marxist reading of a text is a way to read a story in its special historical moment. The British literary critic Terry Eagleton wrote a famous study, Marxism and Literary Criticism, in 1976. In that book, he explained that the aim of Marxist criticism is to, quote, explain the literary work more fully. This means a sensitive attention to its forms, styles, and meanings, but it also means grasping these forms, styles, and meanings as the product of a particular history. You do not have to be a Marxist to perform Marxist literary theory. Even though I'm not a Marxist, I think Marxist readings are some of the most valuable ways to approach literature, especially literature in translation from a language and culture that isn't your own. The novella, The Luminous, Fairies, and Mothra, suggests to its own reader that a Marxist reading might be appropriate. The narrator reminds us, quote, the entire century has been one of politics, and in the contemporary world, even the arts are used for political purposes. And the history of the novella, which we'll discuss in a few minutes, backs a Marxist reading up, too. In Engels' Marxist reading, the most important historical background for Mothra is Japanese opposition to the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. As we discussed a few minutes ago, the U.S. ended its occupation of Japan in 1952. The U.S.-Japan Security Treaty is the document that defined U.S.-Japan relations after the U.S. left. Pretty much no Japanese people liked the 1952 U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. Conservatives were mad that the treaty left Japan in what seemed an awful lot like a subordinate position to the U.S. Many progressives and socialists were mad that any American troops were left in Japan at all. After the end of the occupation, there were still more than 80,000 American troops stationed in Japan. Local residents complained about noise, chronic traffic, crime, violence, rape. And even though there were tens of thousands of American troops still in Japan, the treaty didn't even explicitly commit the U.S. to defending Japan if it was attacked. Keep in mind, when we're talking about Japan here, we're not even including Okinawa, which wasn't reverted to Japanese control until 1971. Some liberals pointed out that the 1952 U.S.-Japan Security Treaty aligned Japan with the U.S. in the Cold War. Surely that was a violation of the pacifistic spirit of Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution is a beautiful and profound statement of pacifism. Quote, aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized. Of course, the U.S. wrote the Japanese Constitution, but it was still pretty popular when it was ratified shortly after World War II. Article 9 has become much more complicated and controversial in the last 70 years, but that's well outside of the scope of our episode today. The 1952 U.S.-Japan Security Treaty also gave the U.S. the right to squash domestic Japanese insurrections using U.S. troops. All told, it really wasn't a good deal for Japan, and the Japanese had every reason in the world to be pissed. In September 1952, 5 months after the U.S. officially ended the occupation, the Asahi News conducted a survey about whether respondents thought of Japan as an independent country. 40% of respondents thought sometimes that Japan was not an independent country. Only 18% of respondents thought of Japan as a fully independent nation. For many reasons, that U.S.-Japan Security Treaty grew even more unpopular over the course of the 1950s. Enough Japanese people were unhappy that the Japanese Prime Minister talked the American ambassador into renegotiating the treaty. The U.S. signed a revised version in January 1960. Now the Japanese government just needed to sign it. But by 1960, any military alignment with the U.S. was a pretty unpopular idea in Japan. 59% of Japanese people supported Cold War neutrality. They didn't want to be aligned with the U.S. or the USSR. Only 14% of Japanese people wanted a military alliance with the U.S. There were a lot of reasons that no one in Japan liked the new treaty any better. Controversy over the new treaty is one of the most important contributing factors to what is now known as the Summer of Rage. We've talked a good deal about the summer of 1960. Everything we're covering here is something of a review. You can find more information in earlier episodes linked on the episode page and in Jeffrey Engels' Translators Afterword to the Luminous, Fairies, and Mothra. We've talked about the Summer of Rage so much because it had a huge impact on Japanese literature and especially on authors who came of age in the 1960s. Protests against the new U.S.-Japan Security Treaty grew dramatically through the spring and summer of 1960. These protests are now collectively known by the acronym ANPO, Anti-Security Treaty Protest, when rendered from the Japanese. The night the treaty was finally ratified by the Japanese Diet, the Speaker of the lower house had to be carried into the room like a human battering ram to make his way to the podium. The vote only won because members of the opposition party had already been removed by the police after they staged a sit-in in opposition to the treaty. This is not a great example of democracy. These undemocratic proceedings are now known as the notorious May 19th incident. The protests did not stop even after the treaty was signed. On June 15th, 6.4 million workers went on strike. That's something like 6% of the country's entire population. More than 100,000 people crowded in front of the Diet. They were met with violent ultranationalist defenders. One leftist student group broke into the Diet and fought with police. 23-year-old member Michiko Kanba was killed. President Dwight Eisenhower had to cancel a planned visit to Japan because of the prolonged violence. Days later, on June 18th, more than 100,000 people slept overnight in front of the Diet. None of these tactics worked. Protesters effectively drove the prime minister from office, but the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty still went into effect. Japan's leftist movement and its radically pacifist movement have never really been the same. But what does all of this have to do with the story of a giant moth? Unlike Godzilla, the written version of Mothra appeared before the film debuted. It was published as a serial novella in the Asahi Weekly Supplement. If you read Jeffrey Engels' new translation of The Luminous, Fairies, and Mothra, you'll discover a text that's odd and disjointed. That's partially because The Luminous, Fairies, and Mothra was another scenario commissioned by Toho. It was going to be adapted and changed from the original, so why bother being that careful? The story is also disjointed because 3 different authors contributed to its writing, and none of those 3 seems to have been that concerned with matching the others' style or tone. The authors were Shinichiro Nakamura, Takehiko Fukunaga, and Yoshie Hotta, all born in 1918 and 43 when the novella was published. Yes, I did check their birth dates. Shinichiro Nakamura was an author of Junbungaku, high literature. He had a much more erudite, learned reputation than Godzilla author Shigeru Kayama. Nakamura thought he was brought on board to bring gravitas to a kaiju movie. Ishiro Honda, who directed both Godzilla and Mothra, wasn't on the same page. Honda always thought the film was supposed to be family fare. Quote, like a Disney or Hollywood type picture. Brighter. Nicer. Shinichiro Nakamura has an interesting background. He graduated from Tokyo Imperial University with a degree in French literature. Along with Mothra co-author Takehiko Fukunaga, he and other left-leaning writers founded Machine Poétique, from the French Matinée Poétique, in 1942. 1942 was during the heyday of anti-Western nationalism. Also wartime censorship. After Japan's 1945 surrender, Nakamura's work took up the life of writers and artists living under imperial censorship. Nakamura started working with Toho in 1954. He was the principal screenwriter for the dramatization of Yukio Mishima's The Sound of Waves. He was delighted when Toho invited him to write a fantasy scenario, but he still invited 2 friends to collaborate. In my humble opinion, Nakamura's pleasure in the project stands out. I kind of think the first third of the novella is the strongest. The author of the middle third of the Luminous Fairies and Mothra is Takehiko Fukunaga, co-founder of Machine Poétique. He is the only author we're mentioning today with other work translated into English. His 1954 novel Flowers of Grass, translated by Royal Tyler, is about a bisexual young man dying in a tuberculosis sanatorium. So not a lighthearted work of SF. Most of Fukunaga's work is notable for its anti-authoritarianism and anti-doctrinaire leanings. Yoshie Hotta was an Akutagawa-winning writer with ties to post-colonial organizing. He wrote for the Chinese Nationalist Party, and then he worked with the Afro-Asian Writers Association. He was also affiliated with the Bandung movement, a group of intellectuals from developing nations who wanted to chart a path without aligning with either the U.S. or the USSR. By agreement, Shinichiro Nakamura wrote the first segment of Mothra. He then passed it along to Takehiko Fukunaga, who then passed it along to Yoshie Hotta. And that's how the novella was written. 3 distinctive styles by 3 distinctive writers, 3 different levels of detail, no real attempt to reconcile style or tone. Like I said, it's an odd little book. Any student of world history knows 2 superpowers competed for dominance in the 1960s. The Soviet Union, in Japanese often just Russia, and the United States, in Japanese, America. But the 1960s world of Mothra contains only one global superpower, Rossilica, Roshirika. In case you didn't notice, that name is derived from the first 2 syllables of Russia and the final 2 syllables of America. Roshirika. Rossilica and a character from Rossilica are key to the story's plot. And just a note, sometimes Rossilica is rendered Rolisica in English. I'm going to stick with Jeffrey Engels' Anglicization. The film opens with a ship running aground during a typhoon. The Rossilican military has been conducting atomic tests nearby, and the deserted infant island is contaminated. But the crew is rescued and returns to Japan unscathed. Maybe it was the juice the natives fed to the crew. Natives? Yes, the natives on the deserted island. This is big news. I'm going to stop myself right there to observe that there are some real problems with othering in Mothra. Infant Island culture is a hodgepodge of stereotypical South Pacific tiki culture. Even the name Infant Island is easily read as problematic, and we get lines like, a resident of the island, quote, was living in a way that had been lost to a Japanese scientist and everyone else who deemed themselves civilized. The problem is worse in the film than the novella. It's not great in the novella, but it's pretty clear the authors are at least trying in a vaguely 1960s trying sort of way. And neither the film nor the novella acknowledged Japan's own history as a colonizing power. Japan had colonized a lot of islands, just like Infant Island. The novella is a completely justifiable critique of America and Russia's relationship with the rest of the world. But when one character insists Japan isn't a Rosilican colony in this deeply patriotic moment, the lack of self-reflection is a little glaring. After all, the characters are on a journey to a South Pacific island that the characters themselves quite plausibly helped occupy 15 years before. I don't want to get too bogged down in some of the problems of race and colonization here in Mothra, but I did want to acknowledge I see them, and they are there. When the shipwrecked sailors return from the irradiated Infant Island unharmed, intrepid reporter Shinichiro Fukunaga breaks the story, along with his plucky female photographer Michi Hanamura. The Rosilican Embassy co-sponsors a joint expedition back to Infant Island to find those natives. Rosilican tycoon Clark Nelson is a member of the crew. So is linguist and anthropologist Shinichi Chujo, who hopes he will be able to communicate with the island natives based on his academic background and research. Our intrepid reporter Shinichiro Fukunaga stows away as well. Eventually, the crew encounters two beautiful women who are just a foot tall, that's about a third of a meter. Fukunaga dubs them Shobijin, little beauties. Jeffrey Angles translates the word as fairies. The fairies ask the crew to protect their island from atomic testing. The crew takes their message back to Japan, but keeps the existence of the fairies a secret to protect them. Meanwhile, the sinister tycoon Clark Nelson returns to the island in secret so he can capture and kidnap the fairies. He wants to force them to perform in what becomes a wildly popular secret fairies show. The linguist Chujo, the reporter Fukunaga, and his photographer Hanamura attempt to rescue the fairies, and the fairies warn them that Mothra will come and help them. When she does, quote, good people are sure to be hurt. The viewer watches Mothra hatch from an egg on Infant Island and then approach Japan as a larva. And this isn't secret. She destroys a cruise ship on her way to Japan. She survives a napalm attack. But the Rosilican Embassy insists it has an obligation to protect Nelson's property rights. That's his right to own the fairies. As an American, this feels like a painfully fair critique of my culture. By the time Mothra makes her destructive way to Tokyo, though, public opinion has turned against Nelson and his secret fairies show. The story writes in an awareness of other kaiju attacks, and no one is excited about inviting another one. Nelson turns tail and flees while Mothra builds herself a pupa, a cocoon, at the base of Tokyo Tower. Tokyo Tower had been built just 3 years before in 1958. In the meantime, Rosilica loans Japan the use of its new atomic ray gun to destroy Mothra's pupa. Shockingly, it doesn't work. Fleeing to the Rosilican Newkirk City doesn't save Nelson. Mothra emerges from her pupa in Tokyo as a fully formed adult moth. She then abandons Tokyo. Her fairies aren't there anymore. She flies to Newkirk City and destroys most of it in her search for the fairies. Angry Newkirkers recognize Nelson, and he dies in a shootout with the police. The fairies are returned to Mothra's care, and they fly back to their island home. Just like with Godzilla, there are differences between the film and novella. Some are relatively minor, but still interesting. For example, there are 4 fairies in the novella. In the film, there are only 2. Jeffrey Engels very plausibly suggests that the editorial choice was related to casting. Twin sisters Emi and Yumi Ito, known professionally as the singing duo The Peanuts, play the role in the film. They do it quite well, one of the film's highlights. Other differences are fairly important, at least if you look at them closely. The original novella includes a scene where the Japanese Prime Minister and the Rosilican ambassador attend the secret fairy show together to, quote, put in a public appearance at the theater, and that public appearance should, quote, act as a gentle breeze to calm down tensions. What tensions? Well, according to the novella, quote, not long before, Japan had established a military alliance with Rosilica. Negotiations over the alliance provoked numerous protests, both inside and around the Japanese Diet building. But even so, the Japanese government pressed ahead and ratified the alliance without getting a sufficient level of approval from citizens. Maybe this is ringing a bell? The scene from the novella does not appear in the film. The original novella also calls for Mothra to build her pupa not on top of Tokyo Tower, but on top of the National Diet building. A crowd of upset citizens is supposed to gather outside yelling chants that would sound awfully familiar to anyone who had attended or read news about the Ampo protests just a year before. Rosilica shouldn't be interfering with the affairs of our country. Thanks, no thanks. Jeffrey Engels even quotes Shinichiro Nakamura explaining how he envisioned the original scene. In accordance with the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, the Japanese government requests the deployment of the American military, which envelops the crowds of Anpo protesters shooting at the Diet building. Remember, the 1952 U.S.-Japan Security Treaty actually contains a provision that this is the U.S. military's job. Here we borrow some shots from newsreels. The screen would cut back and forth between the surroundings of the Diet building in Tokyo and the UN conference rooms in New York with increasing speed. And as the excitement reached its peak, the cocoon would break open. The film's producer flatly rejected the plan, saying the proposal was something out of an art house film, not a big-budget kaiju movie. Instead, filmmakers decided Mothra would climb Tokyo Tower, then one of the tallest structures along the Tokyo skyline. Remember that the clock tower in Ginza was a symbol of Japan's World War II-era resilience. Tokyo Tower was a symbol of Japan's post-war reconstruction. In Engels' words, Toho's decision to have the larva perch on it and snap it in half was symbolic. Mothra's presence was quite literally destroying the newly rebuilt, thriving society of post-war Japan. So, still a pretty powerful statement, if not quite the statement the novella's authors had originally wanted. I had rather expected that one of the changes between the novella and the film would be that Toho might flesh out the details authors left blank. When I watched the movie, I thought it kind of had many of the same holes. The story remains a little disjointed. Once you know the story was written by 3 different people, there are obvious lurches between different narratives. And my biggest complaint is that Nelson's motives remain opaque. He's more of a caricature of a bad guy than anything else. Anyone who has lived through the last 70 years of history knows it wouldn't be that hard to invent a more plausible backstory for a rich American bad guy. So why should you read Mothra and Godzilla? Why should you read Mothra and Godzilla even if you've already seen the movies? And why should you read Mothra and Godzilla even if you never plan to see the movies? I'm not a movies person. I struggle with visual storytelling. I always have. But even I was fascinated by the way 4 highly respected authors played a role in 2 of Japan's most iconic films. And as stories, these novellas reimagine 2 of the most important narratives of post-war Japan. In some ways, you can't tell the story of nuclear weapons and leave Godzilla out. And you can't fully appreciate Godzilla without knowing about Shigeru Kayama and why writing the novel was so important to him. In my opinion, the Mothra film is fairly defanged from the author's original intentions, but it is still a creative retelling of the biggest protest in Japanese history, the closest Japan has ever gotten to a popular democratic uprising, and frankly, a quite inspirational tale for the current global moment. On top of these virtues of the novellas themselves, Jeffrey Engels' afterwords in both books are fascinating. The man writes better translator's notes than anyone else. If you're a film buff or a Japanese literature buff or both, I strongly recommend you pick up these titles. I have summarized some of what Engels has to share, but not nearly all. Today we've been reading from two books, both translated by Jeffrey Engels: Godzilla, from Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again. It's a 2-for-1. Both are by Shigeru Kayama. And The Luminous, Fairies and Mothra by Shinichiro Nakamura, Takehiko Fukunaga, and Yoshie Hotta. North American readers can purchase their copies through Read Japanese Literature's Bookshop to support RJL. The best way to support RJL, both the podcast and the website, is by joining us on Patreon. A special thank you to all Patreon supporters, especially new Patreon supporters, Alina and Name. You can join them by visiting patreon.com/Read Japanese Literature. I hope you do visit Read Japanese Literature's website, readjapaneseliterature.com, especially if you haven't visited recently. My webmaster/spouse and I have been working really hard on updates. It's more searchable than ever before. Even most anthologies of modern Japanese literature are now searchable on RJL. Finally, a quick note that RJL is finishing the process of deplatforming from Meta. We'll be switching off our Facebook page in the next couple of weeks. Keep listening for where else you can find us. We'd love to hear from you about the podcast. Reach us through Patreon, through the website readjapaneseliterature.com, Blue Sky @readjapaneseliterature.com, and YouTube /@readjapaneseliterature. A big thank you to Zach Davison for jumping in to rescue when I wondered if kaiju were yokai. Thank you to Patreon supporter Kenji Lane for helping me build the list of Japanese books made into films that you can find on the episode page. Thank you to the Japanese literature communities on Blue Sky and Goodreads, especially folks who read along for January in Japan. I really enjoyed reading with you. And thanks, as always, to producer Kaim for today's music, kaimmusic.com.